As he already mentioned, my name is Brett Bolt, and for my capstone research project, I chose to do the impact social expenditure on poverty rates across the United States. So I'm going to give you a little information on how this presentation is going to go out. I'm going to start out with a little background information, why I chose the topic, why it's important, and as well as why I found it really interesting as well. I'm going to go off the literature, kind of the backbone, all the things I looked at to see that supported my research as well as served as the foundation for it. Moving on from there, I'll go to the theoretical and empirical framework behind the project, looking at the data sources in which I gathered the data from. Then I'll be going over my empirical results from the regression I conducted, and then I'll be ending with a counterfactual and conclusion. So starting off with the background and key findings. When I was doing this project, the main question I wanted to ask is how does social expenditure differ by state, and how does this impact poverty? So one unique thing about the United States compared to any other country around the world is the fact that one, we're so large, and two, our states are so different from one another. They're actually comparable to individual countries from one another. So within each state, the social expenditure actually differs across it. So looking at how that affects poverty rates over time was really interesting. One major outlier that the United States is, out of the many things we are an outlier for, is poverty rates when it comes to developed countries across the world. And this kind of stuck out to me a lot because I thought as a whole we would be more comparable to other OECD countries, but in fact we're actually a major outlier. And I want to see if that's because of our lack of updated social policies or just the structure of our social expenditure as a whole. When I was researching and doing my initial research for this project, I found three main problems with our current social programs. The first one is to correctly identify a target group. And this was hinted at in most of the papers I researched that current social programs actually are not effective at locating the people in which they need help and quickly help them. The second one is proper administration of the program. So going off of lack of finding the people, when they do find the people, it's hard to properly administrate the amount of help that people need or the amount of resources they need to receive in order to benefit their household. And then lastly, possible misallocation of resources. And this comes down to the state expenditure side. So looking at if they're correctly funding the correct programs with the right amount of resources in which they have available to them. Going off the literature, I found a lot of really good literature that supported a lot of different theories, and out of all of them, I found an overarching theme about the different relationships between different social programs. For my project, I decided to use bit-learn coins, and in this research project, what they did actually is they looked at the efficiency and the effectiveness of different social programs, particularly during different cyclical and economic recessions and upturns. And this was very interesting to me to see how these social programs kind of change and kind of result in the poverty rates changing as a whole, seeing how they react to try to counterbalance our economy going into a downturn. From that, I thought it was very interesting, and I wanted to look at more of the economic responsiveness. So I want to see how do social programs affect poverty rates in the future, or better yet, how does it prepare our own economy for more success? The theoretical framework in which I developed for this project was, I try to keep it as simple as possible since poverty rates is a pretty complicated topic. So in a household, there's two main resources, and that's time and money. And especially in a household that's in poverty, they struggle to manage these resources. Usually they need to sacrifice one in order to get by with the other, and so forth and whatnot. And the whole idea of social programs is actually to help these households manage these resources. For example, TANF gives direct cash transfers as well as child care vouchers and workforce training. So TANF actually gives kind of both of these resources to households, almost a cushion to help support these households when they go in times of need. As a whole, TANF affects those households that are in long-term poverty. They seek to help those who are deep and stuck in poverty and hopefully within 1 to 2 years escape poverty as a whole. The other social program I looked at was SNAP, and they give out food vouchers to households. And these are for the households that temporarily fall into poverty, which is the majority of households in poverty. Usually people do not stay in poverty for that long, luckily. And SNAP kind of helps out with that. And this program actually only helps out the money aspect of it. Kind of gives them that extra cushion when they do fall into poverty to help them get back on their feet and manage their resources. The last social program I looked at was unemployment insurance, which gives cash transfers during a transitionary period in between jobs. And again, this is like TANF, it is both time and money aspect of it, as well as the long run. It helps people find the right job. Because as I found through the research, the most struggling thing people have in poverty is finding a consistent job that gives them 40 hours of work and is full-time employment with benefits. Usually they have to work 2 to 3 different jobs, part-time pay with no benefits, and that's where they really get stuck in the cycle of poverty. Going to the empirical framework I conducted for this project, there's a couple different aspects I want to look at. So again, as I mentioned, I took I wanted to look at the 3 different social policies of TANF, SNAP, and UI. And then off of that, I also wanted to see unemployment insurance, unemployment rate, as well as the average income of households per state. I wanted to see how those kind of affect poverty rates as a whole. I then did a lag effect to have the social expenditures from 2007 try to attempt to predict the poverty rates for 2008. As a whole, that just made the regression smoother and made my equation actually more of a prediction rather than just a statement. I did the natural log for the entire equation to make the results more clean, as well as to see how the change in different social expenditure affects the change in poverty rates as a whole, just to see how it would actually react to poverty rates. For this project, I also conducted a panel regression because I used different states as well as different time periods, so having 2 different dependent variables like that, panel regression was the best possible solution. For my predicted sign variables, I predicted them all to be negative except unemployment rate. It would make sense that social programs like SNAP, TANF, and UI would have a negative relationship with poverty rates. As they would increase, hopefully as a result, it would actually decrease poverty rates in the future. Unemployment rate has a positive correlation with, or a positive sign with poverty rates because as you would expect, less people working would result in more people likely to fall into poverty with that lack of income. And then average income is pretty much the opposite of unemployment rate, where the average income in a household rises, you would expect less people to be in poverty because more people have the money resource available to them. For the source of my data, I found the majority of it from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the U.S. Department of Agriculture under Food and Nutrition Service. This is where I found my information for SNAP, as well as the Department of Labor, where I found the information for unemployment insurance, as well as unemployment rate. The United States Census Bureau provided all my information I needed for poverty rates, as well as TANF expenditures. And for this project, I used a 10-year period from 2007 to 2017. And then since I did a lagged effect, I used poverty rates from 2008 to 2018. I thought it was very important for the first part of my regression to include the recession, just to kind of see how the programs responded, as we'll see in a second. So here, before I continue on to my empirical results, I just want to give you guys a general idea of how the data looks. So this is a graph of expenditure per capita, per average, per state for each year. So it kind of sounds complicated, but it's not too complicated. The orange bar, as you can see, is SNAP. The blue bar is TANF, and the gray bar on the very top is unemployment insurance. So one trend you can see right away is that SNAP is very heavily funded. And this again makes sense, since SNAP only targets the majority of people in poverty who go into temporary poverty or briefly fall into poverty for a short amount of time. It makes sense to fund SNAP the most, since it affects the most people. You can also see the variation in SNAP changes drastically during the recession, as well as when we're getting out of the recession in 2010. If you take a look at the blue bar, which is TANF, you can see the variation doesn't change that much. Even during a recession, it's pretty consistent, except in 2009, where it actually decreases when you would think it would increase. Unemployment insurance has a similar relationship, except that changes a little bit more than TANF does. So as a whole, as the main thing I want to grasp here going into looking at the empirical results is that SNAP is the most funded, as well as changes the most between all the social policies. So looking at the empirical results for my regression, I conducted a panel regression. I had an adjusted R-squared of 0.95. That means the variation between the data and my regression line was very small, which is great to see because again, I was not expecting a low R-squared because you would imagine that social expenditures would have a strong relationship with poverty rates as they're very correlated. All of my variables were statistically significant except average income, which was not statistically significant at all, which was pretty unfortunate to see. And all my coefficients were correctly predicted except for TANF, which was actually a positive coefficient, not a negative coefficient. It was interesting to see. And starting off there, I mean, the biggest thing that I expected for this was I was afraid that it would be 0, but to see it's positive is actually kind of worrisome because that means my regression predicted poverty rates only based on 5 different variables. It didn't account for any of the other social variables or economic variables that happen in our society that influence poverty rates, like demographics or location or geography, anything like that. And because of that, that shows that TANF has a lack of change and as a result has little actually a positive effect on poverty rates. So a 1% increase in the change in TANF will result in a 3.6% change in poverty rates. Looking at SNAP, again, this is not too surprising that it's the largest negative coefficient or largest coefficient between the 3 different social policies, resulting in a 1% change in SNAP will result in actually a negative 23% decrease in poverty rates. And again, this is not that shocking to see since SNAP affects the majority of those in poverty and is most widely used. So this was as I anticipated. Unemployment insurance also had a similar relationship as TANF did, except it was negative. And again, this makes sense because TANF and UI, again, affect a lower amount of people, and it's very selective on people who are just transitioning between jobs. Unemployment rate, this was as I expected. Again, it was very statistically significant, as well as a very large increase, where a 1% increase in the change in unemployment rate would result in a 23% increase in the change in poverty rates. And again, going back to what I was saying earlier, this makes sense due to the fact that when people aren't working, it's more than likely they're going to fall into poverty due to this lack of income in the household. And then, even though average income was actually statistically insignificant, it was still good to see, and it makes sense economically, reasoning-wise, that it's actually a negative coefficient as a whole. Going to the counterfactual analysis, I wanted to see how accurate, first of all, my regression was in predicting poverty rates as a whole. So I took the coefficients from the last table, I plugged it into my equation, as well as added 2 onto the coefficient to account for the dummy variables, which I had during my regression. And I predicted poverty rate was 6.5 to the actual 9.9. And while this isn't as accurate as it should be, this means in my way of seeing it is that the social expenditures account for 6.5% of the 9.9%. And as I was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of different social and economic variables that go into affecting poverty rates. So it's great to see it being relatively accurate as a whole. And looking at how we can change different social expenditures to improve poverty rates as a whole, if we're going off solely this equation, obviously the most optimal choice would be to increase funding for SNAP, since it has the strongest negative correlation with poverty rates, and as a whole would more than likely improve poverty rates in the future. Yet, going back to the theoretical framework and the literature that supported this project, I would actually suggest funding for TANF. Even though it's a positive coefficient in this equation, that's because it's not functioning correctly, and that the current funding for TANF doesn't fulfill the current needs of the U.S. population. And because of that, it's either not fulfilling its job correctly, or in other terms, it's just not working as intended at all. And then looking at the relationship between the different social policies as a whole, we can see that UI is in a pretty good state, and it's functioning as intended, as well as helping those during the transitionary period. In conclusion, to summarize what I just informed you guys of, first off, TANF is not receiving enough funding. As I just stated, I believe in my mind that TANF needs to be either redesigned, or better yet, just more funding from SNAP in order to TANF. Even though TANF affects a smaller subset of people, it's still really important because it helps those who are stuck in poverty and who otherwise would have no other chance of escaping poverty. The difference in long-term effects of social policies. And again, this is looking at the difference between TANF and UI compared to SNAP, where SNAP has a larger coefficient, again, because it affects the majority of people, but yet it actually doesn't help people escape poverty. Rather, it just helps people live in poverty, when TANF and UI actually allows people to escape poverty and hopefully move out of it eventually. And because of that, there needs to be more weighted importance on those two policies over SNAP. And if I was going to pursue this project even further, I would start off initially with seeing the different ways that states fund TANF. Unfortunately, I did not have the time or the information to see the difference in funding TANF, whether that's from direct cash transfers or through non-direct cash transfers like child care vouchers and workforce training. So it'd be interesting to see how different states can improve their poverty rates by either going from direct cash transfers or staying with the non-direct cash transfers. Thank you for listening. At this time, I'll take any questions. Yeah, so I'll go back here. So in this equation, I really only want to focus on the variables and relationship between social expenditures, as well as including 2 variables that I hope would have a positive and negative sign with each other. So for me, my focus of the project was just to see how the social expenditures affect poverty rates. And I was worried that if I started including other variables, it would either make my equation less conclusive, or my results I would get, I guess, less targeted to what I was trying to find and discover. I did have, I forgot to mention, but I did have dummy variable for every state, as well as a dummy variable for every year, which would result in 59 dummy variables to help smooth out the equations. Perfect. All right. Thank you, guys.
Wait. Just a second. We can't stop there. We got more questions, right? Somebody has a question. Say a little more about your understanding of the relation of these social programs and poverty as to which way causality goes.
Yes.
So on the one hand, you might say, well, if we increase the social expenditure, it'll help people get out of poverty. On the other hand, we say if poverty goes up, we gotta increase social expenditure because there are now more people who need this service.
Right.
So I'm wondering, on the one hand, you'd say the social programs impact the poverty, on the other hand, you say the poverty impacts how much we spend on social programs.
Right.
Do you have a sense for which of those is more powerful?
I think as a whole, obviously poverty rates, it's looking at the, not to sound political, but looking at the way our government is structured and how we fund different things compared to in Europe. The United States is very lackluster when we're in regards to responding to and trying to combat poverty as a whole. Europe actually in 2013 just redid their entire anti-poverty program and seen a major success in it. But the problem was it cost a lot of money. And the United States has always been notorious for lacking in supporting those kind of ideas, but yet we properly respond to recessions and time of need. So if we're talking about the United States aspect of it, I think poverty rates have a much stronger influence on social expenditure rather than social expenditure on poverty rates. And I think the easiest way to combat that is either to, again, as I mentioned, kind of what Europe did and restructure their poverty program, because these poverty programs were implemented, I think, in the late 1980s or 1990s and really haven't been touched since. So if we're talking about the United States, I think the poverty rates definitely have a larger and stronger impact on social expenditure.
Was your graph per capita or nominal?
Per capita. Per capita. So I did that in order to balance out, California and like Rhode Island.
Yeah.
So that way there won't be huge outliers. And actually as a whole, that increased my R-squared from, I think I had 0.55 to 0.94. So it really smoothed out the data as a whole.
Can you go to your graph real quick?
Yeah.
For that big snap increase,
Yep.
do you know if like the actual numbers of poverty, of people in poverty increased a ton and that's why it happened?
Yeah, so
Is that why it happened?
yeah, so as you can see in 2007, it's that's when we went into the recession, and
Yeah.
that's the expenditure of it, so it didn't really change.
Um,
And then as the recession goes on, it drastically increases. And
that's-
so the tail end of the recession for 2010 was more than likely a response for the 2009 poverty rates.
So those are kind of telling how many people are in poverty, basically.
Right, right. You can, since the SNAP or the orange bar is the most funded and the most changing, I guess, you can use that to relatively gauge how severe the poverty was.
Are these results lagged as well?
Yes. So it's interesting to see that as a whole, that social expenditure changes, but again, like we were just mentioning, it's a change as a function of poverty rate. So it's interesting to try to do that reverse relationship to see how the United States can maybe help and lower poverty rates in the future.
Do you know why UI is consistently decreasing since 2007?
Right,
Like
so it's
consistent.
decreasing more than likely because our employment rate has probably been decreasing. So as a result, less people are using unemployment insurance. Because that's the main function of it, is you can't, is to help people in between jobs, not rather than those looking for jobs for a long period of time.
What unit is your per capita measured in? Is it like hundreds of like?
Yeah, it's in hundreds of thousands.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to label that. But yep, it's in hundreds per thousand.
Per capita?
Yep,
Per person.
per capita, yeah, per person. Oh, sorry, oh no. That's the summation of everything of all the states, I'm sorry. So it's gonna be, so for 2007, it was $156 per person across the entirety of all the states.
For how long? For a year?
For 2007, yep, and then for 2008, it was about $212 per person, the summation for all the states. So if you divide that by 50, it'd be about, what's that, like 40 something, like 42, 41 dollars per person.
So you added up the 50 per capita numbers to get this number?
Yes, I added up all the states. I did this in order to give a general representation of how our country changes as a whole over time. Because my regression looked at the individual states, but I was worried, so in order to understand how our country works as a whole when it comes to combating poverty rates, I thought it'd be important to include like a general overview of how our expenditure changes over time. So even though this graph isn't an exact representation of my regression, I thought it'd be important in understanding how the relationship between variables occurred.
So, to take 250,
For 2009?
the meaning of that number, you divide that by 50?
Yep, and then that's per person. So say 250 divided by 50 states, that's $50 per person for SNAP that each state spent.
And how long does that period cover for the year?
For the year, correct. That's more than likely in response to the 2008 poverty rates.
That down to like $4 a month.
Yeah,
If you look at, I kind of ran the same core problem with mine, it was, we have, I was looking at a per capita instead of a per case, so there's not, the percentage of people in poverty is that 10% of the entire population, he's dividing it by the entire population, opposed to that 10% that's in poverty, that's actually receiving these benefits. And sometimes it's just hard to find the
This
actual
is
case.
per capita for the population of the country.
country population of the state. So not everybody is receiving SNAP. What he's saying is correct.
I see.
Where so it looks smaller than it actually is, but SNAP is the only in the literature as well as my regression showing, but SNAP is the only social policy that seems to be responding correctly to recessions as well as aiding poverty the most.
Well, thank you.